The autumn sun was setting over Cedar Grove Park, painting the sky in beautiful shades of orange and pink. Officer James Miller adjusted his crisp new uniform as he drove his patrol car along the quiet park streets. At 25 years old, he was the newest member of the local police force, having graduated from the academy just 3 months ago. His badge still had a shine that hadn't worn off, much like his eagerness to prove himself to his fellow officers. As he scanned the nearly empty park, his attention fixed on an elderly man sitting alone on a weathered wooden bench. The man wore a gray sweater that had seen better days, khaki pants that were slightly wrinkled, and old but clean brown shoes. What caught Officer Miller's attention wasn't just the man's presence as darkness approached, but the fact that he had been there for several hours, according to the calls that had been coming into the station. Throughout his shift, Miller had received 3 separate calls from concerned parents about the strange man in the park. They reported that he seemed to be talking to himself, occasionally gesturing at nothing in particular, and hadn't moved from that spot since early afternoon. One caller mentioned that she had to redirect her children to a different playground area because she felt uncomfortable. Officer Miller pulled his patrol car to a stop and observed the man through his window. From this distance, he could see that the elderly gentleman had a small notebook in his hands. Every few minutes, the man's lips would move as if in conversation, though he was completely alone. The streetlights were beginning to flicker on, casting long shadows across the empty playground equipment. Miller thought about his training at the academy. His instructors had always emphasized the importance of maintaining order and safety in public spaces. In his mind, someone behaving unusually in a park, especially at this hour, needed to be questioned. He remembered the praise he'd received last week for clearing out a group of teenagers who had been loitering behind the community center. This situation felt similar. Another chance to show his dedication to keeping the peace. The young officer reached for his radio and called in his location, following protocol. "Dispatch, this is Officer Miller. I'm about to conduct a welfare check on an elderly male subject at Cedar Grove Park, North Entrance." The dispatcher acknowledged his call with a crackle of static. As he stepped out of his vehicle, Miller straightened his back and adjusted his utility belt, making sure his approach would look professional and authoritative. The cooling evening air carried the scent of fallen leaves and distant rain. A few last-minute joggers hurried past, giving both the officer and the elderly man curious glances. What Officer Miller didn't notice was the unmarked police car that had quietly pulled up some distance behind him. Nor did he see the person inside watching his every move with great interest. His focus was solely on the task at hand, dealing with what he perceived as a potential disturbance to the peace. As he began walking toward the bench, Miller rehearsed his approach in his head. He'd start with standard questions: identification, reason for being here, where he lived. The academy had taught him that a strong initial presence could prevent situations from escalating. In his mind, he was doing exactly what a good officer should do: investigating a situation that multiple citizens had reported as concerning. Little did Officer Miller know that this routine check was about to become one of the most important moments of his young career, a lesson that no academy training could have prepared him for. Police Captain Sarah Chen had chosen to take her evening walk through Cedar Grove Park for a reason. After 23 years on the force, she knew the importance of keeping an eye on her officers, especially the newer ones. She'd been hearing things about Officer Miller, nothing terrible, but enough to make her want to observe him in action herself. The evening air was growing cooler as she walked along the tree-lined path, her casual clothes and quiet demeanor making her nearly invisible to those around her. She'd left her badge at the office, but carried her ID and phone out of habit. Her comfortable sneakers allowed her to move silently along the park's winding trails, giving her a perfect view of the scene unfolding before her. When she first spotted Officer Miller's patrol car pulling up near the north entrance, she slowed her pace. There was something in the young officer's body language that caught her attention. That familiar eagerness she'd seen in many rookies, the kind that sometimes led to rushed judgments. She watched as he sat in his car, observing the elderly man on the bench. Captain Chen's heart skipped a beat when she recognized the familiar silhouette on the bench. Even from this distance, she could tell it was Robert Thompson. The way he sat, slightly hunched over his notebook, was as familiar to her as her own reflection. She'd seen him in that exact spot countless times over the years, though newer officers wouldn't know the significance of his presence. Memories flooded back as she watched from the shadow of a large maple tree. She remembered her own first days on the force, when Thompson had been her sergeant. He'd taught her that being a good police officer was about understanding people, not just enforcing laws. The badge gives you authority, he used to say, but it's your humanity that earns you respect. She noticed how Miller was preparing himself, adjusting his uniform and belt, clearly getting ready to approach the situation as if it were a potential threat. Chen could almost see herself 15 years ago, making the same mistakes, until Thompson had taught her a better way. A small smile crossed her face as she remembered how Thompson had corrected her own overzealous approach to a similar situation. The sunset had painted the sky in deep purples now, and the park's lights cast a gentle glow over the scene. A cool breeze rustled through the trees, carrying the distant sound of children being called home for dinner. Chen moved closer, staying just out of sight behind a row of carefully trimmed bushes. She wanted to hear every word of what was about to happen. She watched Miller step out of his car, noting how he squared his shoulders and checked his belt one more time. Chen recognized these gestures, the subtle signs of a young officer trying to project authority. She'd done the same thing countless times before learning that true authority came from understanding and respect, not just a uniform and a badge. As Miller began his approach toward the bench, Chen felt torn between her instinct to step in immediately and her desire to let this become a teaching moment. She knew Thompson could handle himself. He'd handled far more difficult situations in his decades of service. But she also knew that what was about to unfold could shape Miller's entire career, just as her own similar experience had shaped hers. The park had grown quieter now, with only a few evening joggers passing by. The scene was set for what Chen knew would become either a mistake or a moment of growth for her young officer. She moved a few steps closer, ready to intervene if necessary, but hoping that both men, one at the beginning of his career and one long after its end, might help each other understand something important about what it truly means to serve and protect. Officer Miller's footsteps crunched on the gravel path as he approached the bench. The elderly man didn't look up, seemingly lost in the pages of his worn notebook. The evening had grown quiet enough that Miller could hear the gentle rustle of pages turning in the cool breeze. He stopped a few feet from the bench, positioning himself to appear as authoritative as possible. "Sir," Miller called out, using his official police voice, the one he practiced countless times in the academy. "I need to speak with you." His hand rested casually near his belt, a stance he'd been taught to use when approaching unknown situations. Robert Thompson looked up slowly from his notebook, his weathered face calm and peaceful despite the interruption. His eyes, though aged, held a clarity and intelligence that Miller hadn't expected. The elderly man carefully closed his notebook, placing it on his lap as if it were something precious. "Good evening, officer," Thompson replied, his voice carrying a warmth and dignity that seemed to ripple through the evening air. "How can I help you?" His response was so composed, so different from the confused or defensive reactions Miller usually received, that it momentarily threw the young officer off balance. Recovering quickly, Miller pressed on. "I'm going to need to see some identification, sir. We've had several complaints about someone loitering in the park." He tried to keep his voice firm and professional, though something about the old man's demeanor made him feel slightly uncomfortable, as if he were the one being evaluated. Thompson tilted his head slightly, studying the young officer's face. "Loitering," he repeated, a hint of amusement in his voice. "I suppose sitting on a park bench could look that way to some people." He made no immediate move to reach for identification, which made Miller tense slightly. "Sir, it's getting dark, and you've been here for hours. Parents have expressed concern about their children's safety." Miller continued, his voice growing more stern. "If you don't have any official business here, I'm going to have to ask you to move along." A sad smile crossed Thompson's face as he looked at the empty playground, then back at the young officer. "Official business," he said softly, as if tasting the words. "Tell me, officer." He paused, looking at Miller's nameplate. "Officer Miller, what makes a person's presence in a public park official or unofficial?" The question caught Miller off guard. He'd expected either immediate compliance or resistance, not this calm, philosophical inquiry. "Sir, I'm not here to debate park policies. I need to see your ID now, or we're going to have a problem." He took a step closer to the bench, his patience wearing thin. Thompson sighed, but it wasn't a sigh of frustration or fear. It was the kind of sigh a teacher might make when watching a student struggle with a simple but important lesson. "Young man," he said, his voice taking on a gentle but firm tone, "before I show you my identification, I'd like you to look around this park and tell me what you see." Miller felt his face flush slightly. This wasn't how these interactions were supposed to go. "Sir, this isn't a game. I need your ID now." His hand moved more deliberately toward his belt, though something in Thompson's steady gaze made him feel foolish for the gesture. The old man remained unruffled, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to Miller's growing agitation. "I see a young officer," Thompson said quietly, "doing what he thinks is right, just as I did many years ago. But sometimes, son, what we think we see isn't the whole picture." The evening air seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment, filled with unspoken words and lessons waiting to be learned. Neither man noticed the figure watching from nearby, waiting for just the right moment to step forward and bridge the gap between experience and enthusiasm, between assumption and understanding. Captain Chen's heart tightened as she watched the scene unfold before her. Every detail suddenly clicked into place like pieces of a puzzle. The familiar bench, the worn notebook, the quiet dignity in Thompson's posture. This wasn't just any bench in any park. This was where Margaret Thompson had waited for her husband every evening for over 3 decades. The notebook in Thompson's hands, she now realized, was the same one she'd seen Margaret writing in during those long evenings of waiting. Margaret had been a high school English teacher, and she'd spent those hours composing poetry while waiting for her husband to finish his shift. Chen remembered the day Margaret had shown her some of those poems, her eyes twinkling as she shared verses about patience, love, and dedication. As Chen moved closer, careful to stay hidden behind a large oak tree, more memories flooded back. She remembered her first week as a rookie officer, when she'd been terrified of making mistakes. It was Thompson who had taken her under his wing, showing her that being a good police officer meant more than just following rules and procedures. The sight of Thompson on this bench brought back a particular evening 15 years ago. It had been a rough day, and Chen had been ready to quit the force after a difficult confrontation with an angry teenager. She had stopped by the park, and there sat Thompson and Margaret, sharing a thermos of coffee. They had invited her to join them, and for 2 hours they had talked about everything except police work. That conversation had changed her entire approach to her job. Now, watching Officer Miller standing tensely before Thompson, Chen could see history repeating itself. The young officer's rigid posture reminded her so much of herself at that age, so certain of everything, yet understanding so little. Miller couldn't know that the man he was confronting had trained 3 generations of police officers in their department. He couldn't know that Thompson's community policing methods had become legendary, or that his techniques were still taught at the academy. The evening air carried the soft sound of Thompson's voice as he spoke to Miller. Even now, years after retirement, he maintained that same gentle but authoritative tone that had guided so many young officers through their early struggles. Chen watched as Thompson's hands, still strong despite their age, held the poetry notebook, Margaret's last gift to him before she passed away 2 years ago. Chen's trained eye caught the subtle changes in Miller's stance as Thompson spoke. The young officer's shoulders remained stiff, but his hand had moved away from his belt. It was a small change, but Chen recognized it as the first crack in his armor of certainty. She had seen this moment dozens of times during Thompson's years as a training officer, that precise instant when a rookie's black and white worldview began to show shades of gray. The park lights cast long shadows now, and the evening had grown quiet, except for the distant sound of traffic and the occasional call of a bird settling in for the night. Chen could see Thompson glance briefly toward the west side of the park, where the old police station used to stand. That had been his daily walk, from the station to this bench, where Margaret would be waiting with her notebook and her smile. As the tension between the two men reached its peak, Chen knew it was time to step forward. This moment wasn't just about preventing a mistake. It was about preserving a legacy. Thompson had spent his career building bridges between the police and the community, teaching officers to see people first and situations second. She couldn't let his own story become an example of the very thing he had worked so hard to prevent. The poetry notebook trembled slightly in Thompson's hands, not from fear, Chen knew, but from the weight of memories it contained. This was more than a simple misunderstanding between a rookie officer and an elderly man in a park. It was a moment that could either reinforce walls or break them down, a chance to show that true police work was about understanding hearts as much as enforcing laws. Captain Chen chose her moment carefully, stepping out from the shadows with deliberate grace. The sound of her footsteps on the gravel path caused both men to turn. The park lights caught the silver in Thompson's hair, and for a moment she saw him as he had been 20 years ago, strong, proud, and infinitely patient. "Good evening, Robert," she called out warmly, her voice carrying easily through the evening air. "I thought I might find you here." She watched Miller's eyes widen as she approached, noting how his posture shifted from authoritative to uncertain in the space of a heartbeat. Thompson's face broke into a gentle smile of recognition. "Sarah Chen," he said, his voice rich with affection. Or should I say Captain Chen now? His eyes twinkled with the same wisdom that had guided her through her early years on the force. Miller stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, as he watched his captain walk up and place a friendly hand on Thompson's shoulder. The young officer's face flushed as he began to realize he might have misread the situation entirely. "Officer Miller," Chen said, turning to address him with a calm but firm tone, "I'd like you to meet someone very special." She gestured to Thompson, who remained seated, his notebook still resting carefully in his lap. "This is retired Sergeant Robert Thompson. He served on our force for 35 years and trained many of our current senior officers, including me." The color drained from Miller's face as the implications of his earlier behavior sank in. His hand, which had been so close to his utility belt, now hung limply at his side. I didn't know," he stammered, looking between Chen and Thompson with new eyes. Thompson chuckled softly, the sound carrying no trace of anger or resentment. "How could you have known, son?" he asked gently. "That's partly why Sarah is here, I suspect. Some lessons can't be taught in the academy." Chen nodded, moving to stand between them like a bridge connecting two generations of law enforcement. "Sergeant Thompson, Robert, was one of our most respected officers," she explained to Miller. "He developed our community outreach program, and his methods are still taught at the academy today." She watched as Miller's training battled with his embarrassment. The young officer straightened his spine, trying to maintain his professional demeanor even as his earlier certainty crumbled. "Sir, I apologize for my approach. I should have." Thompson raised a hand, cutting off the apology with gentle authority. "No need for that, Officer Miller. You were doing your job, responding to community concerns. That's exactly what you should do." He patted the bench beside him. "Why don't you both join me for a moment? The view from here is particularly beautiful at this time of evening." Chen saw the hesitation in Miller's stance and decided to help bridge the gap. "Robert has been coming to this bench every evening for decades," she said softly. "It's not just any bench in the park. It's where his wife Margaret used to wait for him after his shifts." The notebook in Thompson's hand suddenly took on new meaning for Miller, who looked at it with dawning understanding. The evening breeze rustled through the trees above them, as if nature itself was waiting to see how this moment would unfold. "You said something earlier about official business," Thompson said, his voice carrying years of wisdom. "Well, Officer Miller, sometimes the most important business we conduct in uniform isn't about enforcing laws at all. It's about understanding the hearts of the people we serve." The three of them sat together on the bench as the evening settled around them. Thompson opened his notebook carefully, its pages softened by years of handling. Miller noticed how the spine was worn in a way that spoke of daily reading, and how some pages had small dots where tears had once fallen. "I met Margaret right here," Thompson began, his voice soft with memory. "It was 1978, and I was a rookie officer, not much older than you are now, Miller." His fingers traced the edge of a page filled with neat handwriting. "She was a high school English teacher, grading papers on this very bench. I was so busy trying to look official on patrol that I tripped over my own feet right in front of her." Captain Chen smiled, having heard this story before, but understanding its importance for Miller's benefit. The young officer leaned forward slightly, his earlier tension forgotten as he listened. "Instead of laughing at me," Thompson continued, "she asked if I was okay and offered me half of her sandwich. Said I looked like I needed to sit down for a minute." He turned a page in the notebook, revealing more of Margaret's careful script. "We talked for an hour that day. She told me she loved this spot because it was where students often came to read or study. She believed that understanding people meant meeting them where they felt comfortable." Miller's eyes moved from the notebook to the playground equipment, seeing the park in a new light. The complaints about a suspicious person suddenly seemed shallow and misguided. "After we married," Thompson went on, "Margaret would come here every evening with her notebook. She'd grade papers or write poetry while waiting for my shift to end. Said it made her feel closer to me, knowing she was near where I was working." His voice caught slightly. 45 years we shared this bench, through promotions, through hard days and good ones, through the birth of our children and grandchildren." He turned another page, revealing a poem written in Margaret's elegant handwriting. "She wrote this one after watching me talk down an angry teenager who was about to make a terrible mistake. The boy reminded me of myself at that age, angry at the world, needing someone to listen rather than lecture." Thompson's eyes met Miller's. "That boy became a teacher himself, you know. Still sends me, a Christmas card every year." The evening had grown cooler, but none of them noticed. Thompson continued to share stories about his years of service, each one connected to this bench and the woman who had shared his life. He spoke of difficult cases solved through patience and understanding, of community members who became friends, of young officers he had mentored who now held high positions in departments across the country. "What the concerned parents saw today," Thompson explained gently, "was an old man talking to himself. What they couldn't know was that I was reading Margaret's poems aloud, just as she used to read them to me. This notebook," he patted it softly, "this is 45 years of love, observation, and wisdom about our community. Margaret didn't just write about me or us. She wrote about the people she saw here, their joys and struggles, their hopes and fears." Miller looked down at his polished badge, seeing his reflection distorted in its surface. The notebook in Thompson's hands now seemed more valuable than any official document he'd ever handled. "2 years ago," Thompson said, his voice steady despite the weight of the words, "Margaret passed away. But here, on this bench, reading her words every evening, I can still feel her presence, still learn from her wisdom, still remember what it means to truly serve and protect, not just with a badge and a uniform, but with an open heart and patient understanding." Captain Chen watched the understanding slowly dawn in Miller's eyes as Thompson's story settled into his heart. She recognized this moment, the same transformation she had experienced years ago, when her own rigid views of policing had softened into something more human. Now was the time to help Miller understand the deeper lesson of this evening. "Officer Miller," she said softly, standing up and gesturing for him to walk with her a few steps away from the bench. "Do you remember what they taught you at the academy about community policing? The park lights cast gentle shadows across their faces as a cool breeze rustled through the trees. Miller nodded, his earlier confidence replaced by thoughtful humility. "Yes, Captain. They taught us about building relationships with the community, about being visible and approachable." He paused, glancing back at Thompson, who sat peacefully on his bench. "But I guess I didn't really understand what that meant until now." Chen smiled, remembering her own similar revelation. "You know, when I was a rookie, I was just like you, eager to prove myself, quick to act on what I thought I saw." She gestured toward the playground where parents had earlier expressed their concerns. "I made the same kinds of assumptions, followed the same rigid procedures. Then one day, Sergeant Thompson taught me something I've never forgotten." She turned to face Miller directly, making sure he could see the importance in her eyes. "He told me that our badge gives us authority, but it's our humanity that earns us respect. Every person we encounter has a story, Miller. Every situation has layers we can't see at first glance." The young officer's gaze drifted to the ground, his cheeks flushing slightly. "I was so focused on responding to the complaints, on following procedure. I never stopped to simply observe and understand." His voice carried the weight of recognition. Chen nodded encouragingly. "That's exactly what Thompson's community policing methods were about. He taught us to look beyond our first impressions, to take the time to understand the whole picture." She gestured around the park. "This isn't just a public space we patrol. It's a gathering place of stories, of lives intersecting. Every bench, every corner has meaning to someone." Miller looked back at Thompson, who was gently turning the pages of his notebook in the evening light. "The academy teaches us procedures and protocols," Miller said slowly, "but they can't teach us this, can they? This kind of understanding comes from experience, from moments like this." "That's right," Chen replied, pride filling her voice. "And that's why I'm here tonight. Not just to prevent a misunderstanding, but to help you see what Thompson taught all of us, that true police work happens in these quiet moments of connection and understanding." She placed a gentle hand on Miller's shoulder, turning him back toward the bench. "Look at him, Miller, really look. What do you see now that you didn't see before?" The evening had grown quiet, with only distant cricket songs breaking the silence. Miller stood straighter, but this time not from rigid authority. Instead, from growing respect. "I see dedication, Captain. Love. Wisdom. I see decades of service that didn't end with retirement." His voice grew softer. "I see everything I hope to become as an officer." Chen smiled, knowing that this moment would shape Miller's entire career, just as a similar moment had shaped hers. That's the heart of community policing, Miller. Not just responding to calls and complaints, but understanding the human stories behind them. Sometimes the most important work we do isn't about enforcement at all. It's about being present, being human, and recognizing the humanity in others. The weeks that followed transformed Officer Miller's approach to his duties in ways he never expected. Each evening, as his patrol route took him past Cedar Grove Park, he found himself slowing down, looking for the familiar figure on the weathered bench. More often than not, he would park his car and spend a few minutes of his break sitting with Thompson, listening to stories that taught him more about real police work than any academy training manual. One particularly quiet evening, Thompson handed Miller the worn notebook, letting him hold it for the first time. "Page 43. Thompson said with a gentle smile. "Margaret wrote that one the night after she watched me handle my first major crisis as a sergeant." Miller carefully turned to the page, treating the notebook as if it were made of delicate glass. The poem spoke of strength found in gentleness, of authority earned through understanding. Margaret's words painted a picture of her husband talking to a desperate mother and child, how his patience and compassion had turned a potential tragedy into a moment of hope. Miller read the words twice, letting their wisdom sink deep into his heart. As autumn turned to winter, other officers began to notice the change in Miller. Gone was the rigid rookie who saw every situation as a potential threat. In his place was a more thoughtful officer who took the time to understand before acting. The same parents who had complained about the suspicious man in the park now smiled and waved when Miller walked by on his patrol. One snowy evening, Miller arrived at the bench to find Thompson looking particularly thoughtful. "You know, son," the older man said, brushing snow from the space beside him, "Margaret would have liked you. She always said you could tell a person's character by how they learn from their mistakes." Miller sat down, the cold of the bench seeping through his uniform. "I've been thinking about that first night, sir, about how quickly I jumped to conclusions." He watched his breath form clouds in the winter air. "I almost made a terrible mistake." Thompson chuckled warmly. "The only terrible mistake would have been not learning from it." He pulled out his notebook, now protected from the weather by a plastic cover Miller had given him. Margaret wrote something about that too, about how wisdom often comes from our most uncomfortable moments. The park had become more than just another spot on Miller's patrol route. It had become a classroom, a place where the young officer learned lessons that would shape his entire career. He began keeping his own notebook, jotting down Thompson's stories and insights, adding his own observations about the community he served. Other officers noticed Miller's regular visits to the park bench. Soon, some of them began stopping by as well, drawn by Thompson's gentle wisdom and endless supply of stories. The bench that some had once viewed with suspicion became an unofficial gathering place for officers seeking guidance or simply a moment of peaceful reflection. On Miller's one-year anniversary with the force, Captain Chen called him into her office. "I've been watching you, Miller," she said with a smile. "Thompson tells me you've been quite a student." She handed him a folder. "How would you feel about helping to update our community policing training program? We could use someone who understands both the old wisdom and the new challenges." Miller thought about all he had learned on that park bench, about patience, understanding, and the true meaning of serving the community. "I'd be honored, Captain," he replied, "but only if we can include some of Margaret's poems. They have a way of teaching lessons that no procedure manual can match." That evening, as Miller sat on the bench with Thompson, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors, he realized that his greatest lesson hadn't been about police work at all. It had been about how a simple park bench, a worn notebook, and an elderly man's devotion could teach someone to see the world and their role in it in an entirely new way.